The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell stood among the crowd of tourists, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he clutched a small velvet box. At 62, the former sergeant carried himself with the same military bearing that had defined him for 30 years of service, though the weight of recent months had carved deeper lines around his eyes and stooped his once proud shoulders. Thomas had traveled from his small flat in Manchester specifically for this moment. Inside the velvet box lay his Distinguished Service Medal, earned during a harrowing mission in Afghanistan 15 years earlier. The Bronze Star had once been his most prized possession, a tangible reminder of the brotherhood he'd shared with his unit and the lives they'd saved together. But today it felt like a burden too heavy to carry. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement as they waited for the changing of the guard ceremony. Families posed for photographs, children pressed their faces against the palace gates, and tour guides rattled off historical facts about the monarchy. Thomas stood apart from it all, lost in memories that had been haunting him since he'd received the devastating news 6 months ago. His son James had been killed in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. The loss had shattered Thomas's world completely. James had followed in his father's footsteps, serving 2 tours overseas before settling into civilian life as a teacher. He'd been Thomas's pride and joy, the one person who truly understood the weight of military service and the sacrifices it demanded from families. Since the funeral, Thomas had struggled to find meaning in anything. The medals on his wall seemed meaningless. The ceremonies he'd once attended with pride felt empty, and the very uniform he'd worn with honor now hung in his closet like a ghost of his former self. His wife Margaret had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and now with James gone, Thomas felt utterly alone in the world. He'd come to London with a plan that had seemed logical in his grief-addled mind. He would throw his medal at the palace gates, a symbolic rejection of everything the military had cost him. In his thinking, the service had taken him away from his family too often, had shaped him into a man who struggled to express emotions, and had ultimately failed to protect the one person who mattered most to him. As the morning progressed, Thomas watched the tourists around him. A young father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see better, and the sight made Thomas's chest tighten with pain. He remembered doing the same thing with James when he was small, during rare moments when he'd been home between deployments. Those memories felt both precious and torturous now. The palace guards stood motionless at their posts, their red uniforms immaculate and their expressions stoic. Thomas studied them with a professional eye, recognizing the discipline and dedication that kept them standing perfectly still despite the chaos of the crowd around them. He'd once been like them, young and proud and certain that his service mattered. A tour guide nearby was explaining the history of the guards to a group of American visitors. She spoke about their training, their commitment, and the honor they brought to their service. The words felt like salt in Thomas's wounds. What honor was there in service when it ultimately led to loss and loneliness? What meaning could there be in medals when they couldn't bring back the people you loved? Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and felt the velvet box again. His plan was simple. When the ceremony began and all attention was focused on the guards, he would step forward and hurl the medal as far as he could toward the palace. It would be his final statement about the military life that had defined him for so long. But as he stood there, surrounded by the excited chatter of families and the distant sounds of London traffic, Thomas found himself thinking about James as a young boy. His son had been fascinated by his father's stories of military life, had begged to see the medals, and had declared at age 10 that he wanted to be a soldier just like his dad. The memory brought tears to Thomas's eyes. James had been so proud when Thomas received the Distinguished Service Medal. He'd insisted on wearing his father's beret to school the next day and had told all his classmates about his hero dad. The medal represented not just Thomas's service, but also his son's admiration and the bond they'd shared over their mutual commitment to serving others. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that James had died while serving his community as a teacher, trying to help at-risk youth find better paths in life. Even in civilian clothes, James had continued the family tradition of service, just in a different uniform. He'd been driving home late from a parent-teacher conference when the accident happened, still thinking about his students even at the end of his life. As Thomas stood there wrestling with his emotions, he noticed movement among the palace guards. The ceremony was about to begin, and this would be his moment. He could feel the velvet box growing warm in his sweaty palm as he prepared to step forward and make his statement of rejection and pain. The crowd around him pressed closer to the gates, everyone eager for the best view of the spectacle. Thomas allowed himself to be pushed along, using the movement to position himself near the front where he'd have a clear shot at the palace entrance. His heart was pounding, and his military training warred with his emotional turmoil as he prepared for what felt like the most important mission of his life. But as he raised his arm to throw the medal, something made him pause. One of the guards, a young man who couldn't have been much older than James when he died, caught Thomas's eye. There was something in the guard's expression, a flicker of recognition or understanding that made Thomas hesitate. The moment stretched between them, veteran to serving soldier, across the divide of generations and grief. Thomas's hand trembled as he held the medal aloft, caught between his plan for symbolic rejection and an unexpected moment of human connection. The weight of his loss pressed down on him like a physical force, but something in the young guard's eyes made him question whether throwing away his medal would really honor his son's memory or simply add to the pain that was already consuming him. The ceremony was beginning. Music filled the air, and the crowd's attention turned to the spectacle of tradition and honor unfolding before them. But Thomas remained frozen in place, his medal raised in his shaking hand, caught between letting go of his past and finding a way to carry it forward without being crushed by its weight. The young palace guard, Lance Corporal David Chun, had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours when he noticed the older man in the crowd. Something about the way the veteran carried himself, the familiar set of his shoulders and the haunted look in his eyes, immediately caught David's attention. As someone who had served in Iraq just 3 years earlier, David recognized the bearing of a fellow soldier even in civilian clothes. David had been stationed at Buckingham Palace for 8 months now, and he'd grown accustomed to the tourists who gathered daily to watch the ceremony. Most were excited families, history enthusiasts, or casual sightseers who treated the guards like living statues. But this man was different. He stood apart from the crowd, radiating a grief so profound that David could feel it even from his position behind the gates. When David saw the man reach into his jacket and pull out what appeared to be a metal case, his concern deepened. He'd heard stories from other guards about veterans who came to the palace in moments of crisis, sometimes seeking help, sometimes looking to make statements about their service. The protocols were clear about maintaining position and composure, but David's instincts as both a soldier and a human being were telling him that something significant was about to happen. Thomas stood frozen with his medal raised, and David could see the internal battle playing out on the older man's face. The Distinguished Service Medal caught the sunlight as it trembled in Thomas's grip, and David recognized it immediately. His own grandfather had earned the same decoration during the Falklands conflict, and David knew the kind of courage and sacrifice it represented. The ceremony continued around them, but David found himself locked in a silent communication with the grieving veteran. He could see tears streaming down Thomas's face now, and the man's whole body was shaking with the effort of holding back his emotions. Whatever had brought him to this moment, David sensed it was about more than just military service or political protest. David's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. His orders were explicit about maintaining his post and not breaking formation during the ceremony. The palace had strict rules about guards interacting with the public, especially during official duties. But everything in his training as a soldier and his instincts as a human being told him that this man needed help. As the music swelled and the changing of the guard ceremony reached its crescendo, Thomas's resolve finally cracked. The medal slipped from his fingers, falling toward the cobblestones in what seemed like slow motion. The small bronze star that had once represented his greatest achievement was about to be lost forever, just like everything else that had given his life meaning. But David moved faster than protocol would normally allow. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward from his position and caught the falling metal just inches from the ground. The action was so quick and unexpected that most of the crowd didn't even notice. Their attention focused on the colorful pageantry of the main ceremony. David stood up slowly, holding the medal carefully in his white-gloved hand. He looked directly into Thomas's eyes, and, in that moment, both men understood that something profound had just occurred. The young guard had risked his career and broken every rule of his post to save a stranger's most precious possession. Thomas stared at David in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The kindness of the gesture, coming from someone who owed him nothing and risked everything to help him, broke through the wall of grief and anger that had been building for months. Fresh tears streamed down his face, but these were different from the bitter tears he'd been shedding since James's death. David carefully handed the medal back to Thomas, their fingers touching briefly as the exchange took place. The young guard's eyes were full of understanding and compassion, and Thomas could see in them the reflection of his own younger self, full of purpose and dedication to something larger than himself. "Your son would want you to keep this?" David whispered quietly, somehow knowing instinctively what had brought Thomas to this breaking point. The words were barely audible over the ceremony music, but they hit Thomas like a physical blow. How could this young stranger understand so much about his pain? Thomas clutched the medal to his chest, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. He wanted to speak, to thank the guard, to explain why he'd almost thrown away the decoration that had once meant everything to him. But David had already stepped back into position, his expression returning to the stoic mask required of palace guards. The ceremony continued around them, but both men were forever changed by their brief interaction. Thomas stood among the crowd, holding his medal and watching the young guard who had saved it. He began to see David not just as a symbol of military duty, but as a reminder that service could still mean something, that there were still people willing to risk everything to help others. For the first time since James's death, Thomas felt something other than crushing despair. The grief was still there, sharp and overwhelming, but alongside it was a flicker of hope. Maybe throwing away his medal wouldn't have honored James's memory after all. Maybe the better way to remember his son was to find meaning in the service they'd both chosen, despite its costs. David, meanwhile, was processing his own emotions as he returned to his duties. He'd acted on pure instinct, moved by the obvious pain of a fellow veteran. The risk he'd taken by breaking protocol could result in serious disciplinary action if his superiors had noticed. But, looking at the gratitude and newfound hope in the older man's eyes, David knew he'd made the right choice. As the crowd began to disperse after the ceremony, Thomas lingered near the gates. He wanted to thank David properly, to explain what his gesture had meant, but he understood that the guard was still on duty and couldn't be approached. Instead, Thomas simply stood there, holding his medal and trying to process the unexpected turn his day had taken. Other tourists pushed past him, chattering about the spectacle they just witnessed, completely unaware of the small drama that had played out in their midst. But Thomas remained rooted to the spot, staring at the medal in his hands and thinking about James, about service, and about the young guard who had reminded him that kindness and courage could still be found in the darkest moments. The sun had moved higher in the sky, and the shadows on the cobblestones had shortened. Thomas realized he'd been standing there for nearly an hour, lost in thought and memory. For the first time in months, he wasn't consumed by anger and bitterness. The pain of losing James was still there, would probably always be there. But David's simple act of compassion had shown him that there might be other ways to carry that grief. As he finally turned to leave, Thomas took one last look at David, who was still standing at attention at his post. The young guard caught his eye briefly and gave an almost imperceptible nod, a final acknowledgement of the connection they'd shared. Thomas nodded back, clutching his medal tightly, and walked away from the palace with the first sense of purpose he'd felt since his world had fallen apart. 3 days after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Thomas sat in his small Manchester flat staring at the Distinguished Service Medal that now lay open on his kitchen table. The bronze star gleamed under the fluorescent light, no longer feeling like a burden but not yet feeling like the source of pride it had once been. David's words kept echoing in his mind. Your son would want you to keep this. Thomas had spent the past 72 hours thinking about James, really thinking about him for the first time since the funeral instead of just drowning in grief. He remembered how excited his son had been about his father's military service, how James had written school essays about heroes and always used his dad as the primary example. But more than that, Thomas began to remember how James had carried those lessons of service into his own life. The young guard's intuitive understanding of Thomas's pain had shaken something loose in the grieving father's mind. David had risked his career to save a stranger's medal, acting purely on compassion and instinct. It reminded Thomas of something James used to say about teaching, that sometimes the most important lessons couldn't be planned, they just happened when someone was brave enough to step outside the rules to help another person. That afternoon, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up the phone and called Sarah, James's widow, for the first time since the funeral. The conversation had been awkward at first, both of them struggling with their shared grief and the complicated dynamics that had always existed between them. But when Thomas told her about what had happened at the palace, Sarah began to cry. Dad would have loved that story, she said through her tears. He always said that real heroes were the people who helped others without expecting anything in return. It was the first time since James's death that they talked about him in the present tense of memory rather than the past tense of loss. Sarah told Thomas that James's students at the inner-city school where he'd taught had been asking about him constantly. Many of them came from military families themselves, and James had often shared stories about his father's service as a way of connecting with kids who understood the challenges of having parents in dangerous jobs. The principal had mentioned wanting to do something to honor James's memory, but Sarah hadn't known what would be appropriate. As they talked, an idea began to form in Thomas's mind. James had always said that the best way to honor military service was to continue serving others in whatever capacity you could. Maybe there was a way to combine his military experience with his son's passion for helping at-risk youth. That evening, Thomas found himself digging through boxes of James's things that he'd been unable to touch for months. Sarah had packed them after the funeral, but they'd been sitting in Thomas's spare room like painful reminders of everything he'd lost. Now, for the first time, he was able to look through them with something other than despair. Among James's teaching materials, Thomas found lesson plans about courage, leadership, and service. His son had created an entire curriculum around military values, not as recruitment tools but as life skills that could help young people navigate difficult circumstances. James had written extensively about how military training in discipline, teamwork, and problem-solving could be adapted for civilian challenges. Thomas also found letters from former students, thanking James for believing in them when nobody else would. One young man wrote about how James's stories about his father's military service had inspired him to join the army instead of following his friends into gang activity. A teenage girl described how James's lessons about courage had given her the strength to report abuse at home. Story after story revealed the profound impact James had made in his brief teaching career. Reading through these materials, Thomas began to understand something he'd missed in his grief. James hadn't died randomly or meaninglessly. He'd been killed while driving home from a parent-teacher conference where he'd been trying to help a struggling student, still serving others right up to the end. His death was tragic and unfair, but his life had been full of purpose and positive impact. The next morning, Thomas did something he hadn't done in months. He put on his best civilian clothes, pinned his Distinguished Service Medal to his jacket, and took the train to London. But this time, he wasn't going to Buckingham Palace to throw away his past. He was going to find Lance Corporal David Chun and properly thank the young man who had helped save him from making a terrible mistake. Getting access to speak with a palace guard proved more challenging than Thomas had anticipated. Security protocols meant that he couldn't simply approach the gates and ask to speak with David. But Thomas's military background had taught him patience and persistence, and he was determined to find a way. He spent the morning observing the guard rotations and talking to other tourists who seemed to be regular visitors. Eventually, he struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Mrs. Hartwell who came to watch the ceremony every week and had gotten to know some of the guards over the years. When Thomas explained what had happened and why he wanted to thank David, Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears. Her own grandson had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, and she understood both Thomas's grief and his need to acknowledge the kindness he'd been shown. She promised to help him find a way to deliver a proper thank you. Mrs. Hartwell had connections through a military families support group, and by that afternoon, she'd arranged for Thomas to leave a letter with the palace guard's commanding officer. It wasn't the face-to-face meeting Thomas had hoped for, but it would have to do. Thomas spent hours crafting the letter, trying to find words adequate to express what David's gesture had meant to him. He wrote about James, about his own struggles with grief, and about how a young guard's simple act of compassion had reminded him that service and sacrifice could still have meaning even in the darkest times. In the letter, Thomas also shared his idea about creating a program that would bring military veterans into schools to work with at-risk youth, combining his experience with James's educational insights. He asked if David might be interested in being involved when his palace duties ended, not because he owed Thomas anything, but because he'd already demonstrated the kind of character that would make him effective at helping young people. That evening, as Thomas rode the train back to Manchester, he felt lighter than he had in months. The medal on his chest no longer felt like a burden or a meaningless token. It was becoming something new, a bridge between his past service, his son's memory, and a future that might still hold purpose and meaning. For the first time since James's death, Thomas allowed himself to imagine moving forward without feeling like he was betraying his son's memory. The grief would always be there, but David had shown him that it didn't have to consume everything else. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply catch someone when they were falling, whether that someone was a dropping medal or a broken human being. The train pulled into Manchester Station just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Thomas of better days. He walked home through streets that no longer felt empty and foreign, carrying his medal and his memories and a newfound sense that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. 2 weeks after delivering his letter, Thomas received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was young and formal, with a slight accent that Thomas couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Lance Corporal David Chin. I received your letter through my commanding officer, and I was wondering if we might be able to meet." Thomas's heart nearly stopped. He'd hoped his letter would reach David, but he hadn't expected a direct response. The young guard explained that he had a day off coming up and would be happy to take the train to Manchester if Thomas was available to meet. Something in David's voice suggested this was more than just a polite acknowledgement of Thomas's gratitude. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near Manchester city centre, and Thomas spent the intervening days nervously anticipating the encounter. He wasn't sure what he expected from David, or what the young man might expect from him. The incident at the palace had felt so significant to Thomas, but perhaps David saw it as just another day on duty. When David arrived at the cafe, Thomas almost didn't recognize him out of uniform. The young man looked even younger in civilian clothes, perhaps 25 at most, with intelligent eyes and a serious demeanor that reminded Thomas of his own early military years. They shook hands formally before sitting down, both men clearly unsure how to begin such an unusual conversation. David spoke first, his voice quiet but steady. "I wanted to thank you for your letter, Mr. Mitchell. I've been thinking about what happened that day ever since." What followed was one of the most honest conversations Thomas had experienced in years. David explained that he'd grown up in a military family, his father having served in the Royal Navy and his grandfather in the Army during World War II. He understood the weight that military service could place on families, and he'd recognized something familiar in Thomas's grief that day at the palace. "My grandfather struggled after he came back from the war," David confided. "He never talked about it much, but My grandmother told us stories about how hard it was for him to adjust to civilian life. He lost several close friends in combat, and I think he carried that guilt for the rest of his life. When I saw you with that medal, something about your expression reminded me of him." Thomas listened with growing amazement as David revealed his own story. The young guard had joined the military partly to honor his family's tradition of service, but also because he'd felt directionless after finishing school. His deployment to Iraq had been brief but intense, and he'd come back with his own questions about the meaning of military service in a complex world. "Working at the palace has been interesting," David continued, "but sometimes it feels more like theater than real service. Standing at attention while tourists take photographs isn't exactly what I imagined when I enlisted. I've been thinking about what comes next, about how to use my training to make a real difference." Thomas shared his own story then, talking about James in a way he hadn't been able to since his son's death. He described his son's passion for teaching, his ability to connect with difficult students, and his belief that military values could be adapted to help young people overcome civilian challenges. As he spoke, Thomas could see David becoming increasingly interested. The conversation continued for hours, ranging from their shared military experiences to their thoughts about service, duty, and finding meaning in difficult circumstances. Thomas learned that David had a degree in social work that he'd earned through distance learning during his service, and that he'd always been interested in working with young people. By the time they finished their coffee, both men realized they'd found something unexpected in each other. Thomas had discovered a young person who shared his son's passion for helping others, while David had found an older veteran who could serve as both mentor and partner in a meaningful new endeavor. Thomas pulled out a folder he'd brought with him, containing some of James's teaching materials and his preliminary ideas for the Veteran Youth Program. As David looked through the documents, his excitement became obvious. The curriculum James had developed was exactly the kind of practical application of military training that David had been hoping to find. "This is brilliant," David said, studying one of James's lesson plans about leadership under pressure. "Your son really understood how to translate military concepts for civilian use. This could help so many kids who are facing the same kinds of challenges we train to handle in the service." They spent another hour discussing the practical aspects of implementing such a program. David's experience with current military training combined with Thomas's years of service experience and James's educational insights created a powerful foundation for something truly innovative. As they prepared to leave, David made a suggestion that surprised them both. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this might sound presumptuous, but I finish my palace assignment in 3 months. If you're serious about developing this program, I'd like to be involved. I mean really involved as a partner, not just a volunteer." Thomas felt something lift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since before James's death. Here was someone young and capable and passionate about the same kinds of service that had defined both Thomas's and James's lives. It felt like a gift from his son, a way of continuing their shared commitment to helping others. They shook hands again as they parted, but this time it felt less like a formal ending and more like the beginning of something important. Thomas walked home through Manchester streets with a sense of purpose he'd thought was lost forever. The medal in his jacket pocket no longer felt heavy with grief. It had become a symbol of continuity, of values passed from one generation to the next. That evening, Thomas called Sarah to tell her about his meeting with David. She was quiet for a long time after he finished the story, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "James would have loved him," she said simply. "And he would have been so proud of you, Thomas. He always worried that you'd never find a way to be happy after the military. I think he'd see this as exactly the kind of second chapter he'd want for you." Sarah had news of her own. James's principal had been asking again about ways to honor his memory, and several of his former students had requested permission to organize something themselves. When Thomas told her about his plans with David, Sarah immediately saw the connection. "The school would be perfect for piloting your program," she said excitedly. "The kids already know about James and his military family background. They'd be receptive to learning from veterans, especially if they understood it was connected to Mr. Mitchell's memory." As Thomas went to bed that night, he realized that for the first time in months, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The conversation with David had shown him that grief didn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes loss could become the foundation for something new, something that honored the person you'd lost while creating meaning for others who were still living. He took out his Distinguished Service Medal one more time before sleep, holding it up to catch the light from his bedside lamp. The bronze star gleamed just as it had that day at Buckingham Palace, but now it represented something different. It was no longer just a reminder of his own past service. It had become the seed of a future that would combine his experience, his son's vision, and a young guard's compassion into something that could help others find their way through their own dark moments. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the same classroom where his son James had once taught, watching as David Chun demonstrated a leadership exercise to a group of 15 teenagers who had initially seemed skeptical about spending their Saturday morning with 2 old soldiers. The transformation in both the room and the participants over the past 3 months had been remarkable. The Mitchell program, as it had come to be known at the school, had started small. Thomas and David had spent weeks developing their curriculum, combining James's educational materials with their own military experience and David's social work background. They'd focused on practical life skills rather than military recruitment, teaching conflict resolution, team leadership, decision-making under pressure, and personal responsibility. The first group had been just 8 students, all of whom had been struggling academically or socially. The school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been cautiously optimistic but realistic about the challenges they faced. Many of these teenagers came from difficult backgrounds, had trust issues with authority figures, and had already given up on traditional educational approaches. But something magical had happened in those first few weeks. Thomas's genuine war stories, delivered without glorification or propaganda, had captured the students' attention in ways that textbooks never could. David's energy and relatability as someone closer to their own age had made the lessons feel relevant rather than preachy. Most importantly, the program's focus on practical skills had given the students tools they could actually use in their daily lives. Marcus, a 16-year-old who had been headed toward exclusion for fighting, had become one of their biggest success stories. The military-style conflict resolution techniques had given him alternatives to violence when dealing with frustration. More importantly, the program's emphasis on protecting others rather than just defending yourself had transformed how he saw his role in his family and community. Before Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Chun started working with us, I thought being tough meant hurting people before they could hurt me, Marcus had told his mother. Now I understand that real strength comes from helping people who can't help themselves. Aisha, a brilliant but withdrawn girl who had been skipping classes regularly, had blossomed under the program's leadership training. She'd discovered that her natural analytical skills made her an excellent strategic thinker, and she'd started organizing study groups for other struggling students. Her grades had improved dramatically, but more importantly, she'd found confidence in her ability to guide and support her peers. The success of the pilot program had attracted attention from other schools and community organizations. Mrs. Rodriguez had been fielding calls from principals across Manchester asking how they could implement similar programs. Local veterans organizations had reached out offering support, and David had been interviewed by a military magazine about innovative approaches to veteran transition into civilian service. But for Thomas, the most meaningful moment had come 3 weeks earlier during a family emergency exercise they'd organized. The students were practicing how to maintain calm and make good decisions during crises when one of them, Jenny, had suddenly started crying. The exercise had reminded her of the night her father had been arrested, leaving her to care for her younger siblings while her mother was at work. Instead of continuing with the planned lesson, Thomas and David had shifted immediately into real-world support mode. They'd helped Jenny develop an actual emergency plan for her family situation, connected her with appropriate social services, and, most importantly, shown the entire group how military-style preparation and teamwork could be adapted to protect and support people you cared about. "This is what your dad was talking about in his lessons about service," David had told the group afterward. "It's not about following orders or carrying weapons. It's about being the kind of person others can count on when everything goes wrong." Thomas had been amazed by how naturally David had made that connection between military training and civilian compassion. The young man had grown tremendously over the past months, developing from an eager but inexperienced former guard into a skilled educator and mentor. More than that, he'd become like family to Thomas, filling some of the emptiness left by James's death while creating his own unique relationship with the older veteran. Their partnership had evolved into something neither man had expected when they'd first met at that Manchester cafe. David brought energy, contemporary perspective, and formal training in social work. Thomas contributed decades of military experience, hard-earned wisdom about leadership, and the credibility that came from having actually lived through the challenges they were teaching about. But perhaps most importantly, they'd both brought their own experiences with loss and recovery. David's grandfather's struggle with post-war adjustment had given him insight into the long-term impacts of service, while Thomas's journey through grief had taught him how to help others navigate their own dark moments. The program had grown beyond what any of them had imagined possible. They now worked with 3 different schools, had trained for other veteran civilian teams to replicate their approach, and had secured funding from a military charity to expand throughout the region. Sarah had become their unofficial program coordinator, using her experience as James's widow to connect with other military families and her professional skills as a nurse to ensure they addressed the complete well-being of their students. But success had also brought unexpected challenges. The visibility of the program had attracted both supporters and critics. Some educators questioned whether military-style training was appropriate for civilian students, while some veterans worried that they were diluting military values by adapting them for civilian use. Thomas and David had learned to address these concerns by staying focused on their core mission, teaching young people practical life skills while honoring the service traditions that had shaped them both. They weren't trying to create soldiers or promote military recruitment. They were simply using the leadership, teamwork, and problem-solving skills they'd learned in service to help teenagers navigate the challenges of growing up in a difficult world. The medal that had once felt so heavy in Thomas's hands now sat in a place of honor in their shared program office, alongside photos of James teaching, David in his palace uniform, and their first group of program graduates. It had become a symbol not just of past service, but of ongoing commitment to helping others. As Thomas watched David work with the current group of students, he felt a profound sense of peace that he hadn't experienced since before Margaret's illness. The grief over losing James would never completely go away, but it had been transformed into something productive and meaningful. His son's vision of using military values to help young people had become reality, and it was making a real difference in the lives of teenagers who needed exactly the kind of structured support and practical guidance that veterans could provide. The session ended with their traditional closing exercise, where each student shared one thing they'd learned and one way they planned to use it during the coming week. As always, Thomas was amazed by the thoughtfulness of their responses and the genuine connections these young people had formed with each other and with their instructors. After the students left, Thomas and David sat in the empty classroom, planning the following weeks.